This is the third CTMU lecture. In this video, we're going to talk about the metaformal system, which is how Chris Lang completes the theory of language. By the end of this video, you will not only understand deeper the structure of natural languages and formal languages, the languages of scientific disciplines, and how they relate to their object universe, but how reality relates to itself intrinsically through language. Because this is the primary breakthrough, I shouldn't say the primary breakthrough, it's a primary breakthrough of the CTMU, is that reality is a language. And so, if you think about this rather abstractly, because language always has the connotation of being written or spoken, and this isn't necessarily a bad way to think about it, but if you strip that away, if you strip away the actual terminal representation of that in us communicating through our speech, which is, just different sound waves, etc. That's not what the language really is. It's only how it's communicated. What language is fundamentally is the process of attribution and identification, which conforms to a certain syntax, to certain rules and structure, to a grammar of which the language consists, and, determines the structure of how it can be represented. And then, so this is what reality has to do in order to relate to itself. We've talked about, it's that reality, this is what I talked about with Tyler Goldstein. Reality is essentially a meaning-making machine. The meaning of creation, he says, is the creation of meaning. And meaning is always a linguistic phenomenon. And so, So reality has to communicate with itself. This is the extended superposition principle, is that everything in reality must relate to everything else, and you have to have these broad schemes for self-organization and emergence. It has to communicate its states and read and write to each other in order to form, star systems, biological evolutions, and determine the structure and evolutions of these things according to its intrinsic utility. So reality is a language because it's doing those things about it. And you can say, well, is reality the language, or is reality... So reality is a language which creates the reality it describes. And you can say, is reality the description, or is reality the creation? And the CTMU says it's both. It's a metalinguistic meta-object which is creating the reality it describes such that it can exist and evolve in its own syntax. It's, the various terminal representations of reality are that syntax taking on different semantic representations in order to extract out meaningful order. And so then think about what you're doing when you're talking. I assume most of the people, their first language is English who are watching this, but let's say, what are you doing when you're talking English or French or Mandarin? It doesn't matter. All of these natural languages are relands of the universal language because we're secondary tellers. We inherit the syntax of reality and how it relates to itself in our minds. So thusly, the languages we speak, which have, evolved in coupling with their cultures, or how these, vast ensembles of individuals have related to their universe, to that universal language in order to identify and describe things. And so just as the reality language evolves in coupling with its domain of reference, so the reality language evolves in coupling with the universe, which exists, and the universe itself is a self-simulation of the intrinsic language. I have the equations here, we'll discuss that, but what you need to know for the time being is that it's an intrinsic language which self-simulates through various words and grammar and alphabets. Obviously, when we're talking about the universe as a language, it's not, written or spoken, but necessarily conforms to this structure. So it's a self-simulation of the intrinsic language which creates the reality it describes. That's what reality is fundamentally, which then brings language and universe into coincidence. So it's a metalinguistic meta-object which is simultaneously its description and representation. So too the relands, English, and so you think about Sindifionesis. There's obviously, this is a part of the story of the Tower of Babel is, there are all these different languages, but they're united by this same higher structure which reaches all the way up to heaven. So all these different languages, but of course this comes crumbling down because we need, communication systems which evolve in coupling with the cultures which formulated them. However, all of this diffeonesis, all these different cultures and nations and languages are different ways of identifying that, you know, heavenly structure which reaches up to God. All of these are trying to achieve the same end, which is the identification of reality for the secondary utility of its language users. So the languages evolve naturally. So there's this meta-cybernetic or telic feedback between the users of the language and what they need. You know, this is like, for example, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that but it makes sense, is that the Alaskan native languages, they have like 50 different words for snow because there are tons of different ways they need to build, you know, houses and, you know, not freeze to death. They have all these different uses for snow, some that I probably can't even think of. But so the language evolves according to the utility of the people who are using it, and the secondary utility of reality is exactly how the secondary utility of language is actually how the reality language is described. The universe exists and evolves for the purpose of, you know, giving the global structure such that human beings and other secondarily utile structures, so that's one level down from the primary teller who is God, but the universe is created for the secondary utility, and so are these languages, which evolve naturally in real-world communities or language users for the secondary utility of their users, because people have to describe things, and so there's this network between what people need to describe in order to exist and go about their daily lives, and how the language evolves over time. So reality also exists according to the secondary utility of its inhabitants, meaning a natural language we can define. This is the first level of language. There are 3 levels of languages in the metaformal system. There's natural languages, formal languages, and then which are both somewhat separated from their universe. And then there's the metaformal system, which describes how reality exists and evolves and relates to itself intrinsically, and thus explains the structure of how natural languages and formal languages, which is, you know, physics, mathematics, etc., are formal languages, how these can actually relate to their universe. So a natural language so this is level 1, is the collective enterprise of groups of people over time who have learned to identify reality using speech and writing through the lens of their culture and convention. And it's important to recognize why does reality have to be a language? And the reason for this is actually very simple. If reality were not intelligible to itself, it wouldn't be intelligible to its inhabitants. And the intelligibility of reality is the fundamental category of our experience. Why can we, if reality didn't relate to itself in this intrinsic way, we wouldn't be able to have human experience or scientific observation, because there would be no structure for this. And so thusly, so this is, we've talked about this, this quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel is that, you know, and we can adapt that slightly, is if the structure, if language didn't relate to the intrinsic structure of reality, then there would be no way to identify reality using language. The isomorphism, the mapping between our human languages and the inner language of the universe, is the only reason for that intelligibility. This is what this is one of the main descriptions of the CTMU by Chris Langton, is that it relates intelligence and intelligibility. So in order to have this intelligibility, intelligence and the intelligent design of inhabitants has to be a latent property of the medium. And so although language and universe are related to one another, and in fact language and universe are the same, this basic fact that even if you don't accept that reality itself is a language, you have to recognize that what we're doing when we're speaking languages is referring to an object universe, and that object universe is the universe itself. It's the reality that we're interacting with. So even though language and universe are equivalent, the basic fact that language exists as as referring to an object universe almost never shows up in the academic treatment of languages. So a language is usually defined in terms of its alphabet, grammar, and surface structure of words which are produced by that grammar and alphabet. And so that it has an alphabet which is represented by sigma. It has a grammar which is represented, I actually don't know the letters, but this is the alphabet, this is the grammar, and these are the words. And so L equals alphabet, grammar, words. And yet nowhere to be found in that equation is U, standing for universe. The universe is arguably the most important part of language because this is what it's actually describing. If I say that's a chair over there, that's a physically instantiated object in the universe. And so people will talk about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, that if to kind of disprove the idea that mathematics is a human invention, because if mathematics were only a tool in order for humans to make sense of the world, then it shouldn't describe, the physical relations that we can observe and test and repeat. That would be unreasonable, and so mathematics has to be in some way related to the intrinsic structure of reality. This is Max Tegmark has talked about his mathematical universe hypothesis, and we can extend this to the unreasonable effectiveness of language. If reality is not a language and doesn't relate to itself in a metalinguistic way, why language is even more general and powerful than mathematics? We describe everything using language. Our scientific theories are formulated in languages, and we can communicate and express these ideas. Our even religious scripture, even the things which are claimed to be revelations directly from God, are languages. God in the biblical creation myth, God creates by speech. There are 10 utterances. Let there be light, and let us create man in our image. But we don't even have to make recourse to the supernatural. It's just how, if we're formulating things in languages, why does this work? And this is unreasonable if the grammar, alphabet, and surface structure of languages are not in some ways related to the secondary utility of the universe, which they obviously are. So let's review the language equation and see how it might apply to the universe. If we abstract out the structure of human languages, we can actually begin to study how the universe relates to itself. And so it's words. So there are three things. There's words. There's words, there's grammar, and there's an alphabet. And so its words are not strings of symbols, but relationships among objects in space and time. And space is considered to be information, and time is considered to be generalized cognition or telic recursion, respectively. And telic recursion has recursion, it means self-calling. So it's calling on its own structure in order to exist and evolve and propel it into the future such that it has to reconfigure itself according to an intrinsic teleology. So that's the telic, that it's actually striving towards an end or purpose. This is what I was talking about with Tyler Goldstein. God acts in time, that he acts through this process of telic recursion, which maximizes utility over time. And the way it can do this is it has to communicate states about relationships in space and time through language to itself. So this is what Langen says, reality is a language which talks to itself, about itself, for its own purposes. How does it want to exist and evolve? How can it identify itself with true and good structure and order? And as we know, in order for objects to relate to one another in a physical sense, their forms or ideas must relate to one another linguistically. So there's obviously these physical representations, but that's the surface structure, that's the S, that's the words, that's what's being physically instantiated. But there's actually a deep structure. This is analogous to Plato's world of forms. It's actually a linguistic phenomenon. So these ideas and these forms have to relate to one another linguistically. And language is actually the description of Plato's forms, because it's these metaphysical patterns and these, so it's these patterns existing in metaphysics, in reality itself, which then give rise to the various particular things, and then that is received in the structure of our minds. Our minds are actually associating various symbols and ideas in order to evolve according to our own utility, according to survival imperatives, according to the intrinsic teleology which we receive into ourselves, and then we actually have a generative structure whereby we can use this language in order to adapt and respond to our environment and maximize and choose our own what we find utile, because this value structure is embedded within us, and this couldn't happen unless there was this deep reality which allows for this generative or free will level of causation. And so language is Plato's forms. You can obviously the metaformal system. What Langen is talking about is there are all these formal systems. There's physics, biology, mathematics, whatever, any other academic discipline. There's all these formal systems which purport to describe various aspects of reality, and then you have to have a higher order formal system which actually describes how theory relates to observation. And yet, you can also consider this in another sense, that if you think about Platonic philosophy, there are all these forms, all these different ideas, metaphysical patterns which generate the reality you see. This is what Plato's idea is, that the visible reality, the surface structure, is actually just basically the shadow of this higher world, this heavenly world of forms. And then you say, well, what is the pattern which unites all of those different ideas and forms, and then you have a metaform. It's what actually gives rise to reality, what is its intrinsic structure, and thus you have a kind of Platonic description of God, which is rearranging reality according to the form of the good. This is Plato's idea of God, and so thus these forms are actually an expression of the teleology of God, of Plato's God, as described by the meta-formal system. The grammar, that was the words, and then the grammar is the structure and evolution of the system which relates language to its universe and all the infrastructure to display the state. So the grammar, you see here, it's grammar MU, and the grammar is what relates, there's this idea of the multiverse in quantum mechanics, or what Langen calls the metaverse. So it's the space of potential from which order has to be extracted out according to this meta language by which reality exists and evolves and creates the reality it's described, by giving actual reality to a potential such that it can identify with the structure of that. And then that grammar is, you can see here, the grammar says MU on it, and that MU stands for multiplex unity, and that means that and that's another way of saying the principle of homology, which is that that same structure which describes the filtration and construction of reality at large has to apply to every little point in reality. Every point, the fundamental unit of reality is not actually energy or matter or even information. It's actually a syntactic operator which can then transform the global structure of that language based on the utility at the global and agentive level, so that respectively God and humans, and can transform the structure of the language in order to achieve spatial extension by relating to everything else around it. So everything is related to everything else, and everything is related to the whole, such that reality can coherently exist and evolve according to these various utilities. And it's testing the secondary utilities against the primary utility. So it's like Langen describes it as a hologic self-simulative scratch pad. It's comparing these and seeing how meaningful, how much true and good order can be extracted from various configurations, and thus determining what is intrinsically valuable to it using this linguistic structure. So the grammar is, the rules and structure to which reality must conform in order for it to be the most utile over time. And people will say, basically, the physicalist argument would be that reality is only S, it's only the surface structure, it's only the words, it's only what we can actually see. But let's take the example of a computer. On my computer, you know, I can see a display, but there's actually almost infinitely more structure going into that. There's the hardware, everything, all the apps I have on my computer had to be programmed. You know, the computer had to be constructed somewhere in a factory off in some foreign land. I have to have electricity and the power plants, and everything has to work together. There has to be this intrinsic structure. And then you can relate that even back to the geologic and biological history of the Earth, the people who which then gives rise to the people who actually design the computer and create the companies and finance it and do the product design, and everything has to come together in order to achieve this literal one, pixel display state. And so the same with reality. There's this deep underlying structure which relates language to its universe, which is much more complicated than what is actually being displayed at any one given moment. And then the alphabet, so this is alphabet, NT, and those stand respectively for non-terminal and terminal. The non-term are the tellers and syntactors, meaning God, humans, and particles, for which the language universe is simulated. So so the building blocks of the language universe are actually sentient beings or agent-level tellers. Alone, God has no meaning. He's just existing in himself. He's all in all, and this is great. But there's also, this is the idea of truth is greater than derivability. God's structure actually has to overflow a little bit past, and this is a very classical conception of creation, as an overflowing of God's creative power into something separate from his essence. So God is almost restricting himself in order such that reality can exist and evolve, and God can identify himself with the true and good order which is created separately from his essence, but still according to his teleology, his intrinsic ends and purposes, an actual series of directed aims which seek to fulfill themselves according to. So the teleology of God is not something hovering above God, it's actually an expression of his very being. So these creation is very much related to the creator God, even though they're superficially separate. So God, if God determined everything, the reality would have no meaning, because this would just be God tricking himself. But if God didn't determine anything, there would be no reality. So and so you could say, well, this is left up to only the particles, only the tertiary syntactors, which are the fundamental building blocks of the universe, as we discussed. It's not energy or information or matter, but it's tertiary syntactors, these syntactic operators, these little infinitesimal cuts, which can then get spatial extension according to that teleology. But what is actually determining that teleology if we can't have just God doing everything? And so there has to be an intermediate level of utility by which God can compare the various utility functions and then see in real time on an ad hoc basis how these compare against one another according to the linguistic meaning that they're actually actualizing, and then operate and transform the underlying grammar to instantiate the meaning of primary and secondary tellers. And so the fundamental building blocks of the universe, in a sense, even though the whole thing is created by God, is the sentient being, these agent-level tellers. And this is why Langen says that human beings actually comprise a class of beings with a very specific mathematical formulation and are integral to the structure and teleodynamics of reality. Again, the meaning of creation is the creation of meaning, and if everything is determined, there's no meaning. If everything is random, there's no meaning. But there's a third option. Everything can be self-determinative. It's actually human beings determining their own structure and how they relate to and interact with the universe, in part through these natural languages. This is how I'm communicating with you, and I think I'm actually communicating quite deep and profound ideas, at least in my view. And the reason I can do this is because reality relates to itself intrinsically using language. Again, as Tyler Goldstein said, the meaning of creation is the creation of meaning. It can only instantiate itself through these three levels of stratified utility. So the purpose of the self-simulation of the universe in the minds of secondary tellers, so not only is there this objective manifold being created, but it's being created according to the subjective utility of all these secondary tellers across time. So the structure of reality is determined by how the most meaning, the most, the optimal state for the greatest amount of utility and utility is determined by these secondary tellers in part. The most amount of utility to be created over time, and thus to have an environment where large amounts of tellers can interact with each other and instantiate and communicate and express this meaning. The purpose of the self-simulation of the language universe in the minds of secondary tellers, so the secondary tellers we perceive, and we have this perception and cognition whereby we can objectively model the universe in our minds and then express and communicate meaning on that basis. So this is the idea of the participatory universe, that the structure and evolution of the universe is actually according to the secondary utility of observer participants within it, and this is all happening linguistically. So this is the non-terminal domain is actualizing itself. So this is the spirit world. This is the potentialization of reality, how it's deciding prior to its instantiation how to configure itself. All of this teleodynamics is happening at two levels. It's happening, and these levels are embedded within one another. It's happening at the primary level of God is, creating reality. Blessed is he who creates by his word. So this is obviously linguistic. In some sense, the universe itself can be described as a self-processing, self-configuring language, which is actually both communicating and instantiating itself. But there's also a second level of that non-terminal domain, which is so there are two things happening in N. There's this primary teller, and so N is tellers, it's in the non-terminal. N is tellers in the non-terminal domain, and a teller is something which is relating to reality according to a teleology. If you'll remember Jung's definition of teleology, this is the intrinsic striving towards a goal and a series of directed aims seeking to fulfill themselves. So this is you're both an acceptor and a transducer, so you can take in and transform that input according to the structure of your own, and determine the structure of your own response to that, such that you can on the fly adjust to on an ad hoc basis adjust to various generative requirements. So secondary tellers are very, very important in the non-terminal domain, the spirit world, which is potentializing reality. And then the terminal domain, it also consists of three levels. There's the primary syntactor, which is the same as we'll get to that in a moment. So this participatory universe, God is creating the universe according to the secondary utility of its inhabitants, and so thus we're participating in the creation and evolution of reality. This is John Wheeler's idea. And then God, and so because we are connected to God but superficially separate, God can then identify with the true and good order created separate from himself, and then looks into the metaphysical patterns which generate that order, because this is still being instantiated at the end level of reality. So when I'm doing something good, let's say I'm at a soup kitchen, or I'm helping the poor, etc. This I can look into what is the mental and linguistic structure which is expressing and communicating that meaning, and then I can take that, adapt that to my essence, and then therefore define, reinforce, and extend my structure, which by using that order at the telluric and syntactic level, and then use that information to define, reinforce, and extend my being if I'm God. So this is Alfred North Whitehead's ideas, this idea of process theology, is that God is not a static being. God is actually becoming. He's constantly existing and evolving in his identity according to the secondary utility, because there's this transcendent aspect of God, which is giving rise to the orderly harmony of the universe and allowing everything to exist and creating the universe. But there's also this immanent aspect of God, which is actually relating to you as an individual, and then expressing and communicating the meaning from your incarnation to to define, reinforce, and extend that transcendent aspect. So there's both. Langan talks about the universe is like a very mature child, which has to read into its own state in order for it to mature, in order for it to mature, because it's constantly in the process of the self-identification. It's defining its identity according to how it is, to how these secondary tellers and the patterns of the metaphysical patterns which relate to this symbolic meaning is extending in structure. So this is how you can have a personal God, is through this immanent aspect, which couples with the transcendent or impersonal aspect. So this is, Langan talks about, he believes in a God who can hear prayer and has a plan for our lives and can talk and can communicate with us in a language that we can know, and can orchestrate, essentially miraculous series of events, because he is this primary teller, which then each secondary teller is an image of that global syntax. So you not only have to have telluric, which is, actually free will, but you have to have syntax, which is that us, just by our being, by our instantiation at the surface level of reality, both God, human beings, and particles, are transforming the syntax in order to have spatial extension. So in the terminal domain, we have to have this. So there are two levels of tellers. There is the primary teller and the secondary teller, and these are conscious agentive agents, that's God and humans respectively. And then there are three levels of syntactors. There is the primary syntactor, who's God. This is the impersonal aspect of God, you can think about it, which is giving orderly harmony to the universe, determining the laws of physics, etc. The secondary syntactors are human beings and other similar beings, if they exist in the universe. And then tertiary syntactors are these syntactic operators, or collections thereof, which haven't, even though a table is a very complex thing, it's actually still a tertiary syntactor, because even though it has some internal coherence, it doesn't have any conscious volition, and it's just transforming the global syntax according to the teleology at the primary and secondary levels in order to have the expression of this teleology. So when we God is becoming through these five utility functions, through the primary teller, the secondary teller, the primary syntactor, the secondary syntactor, and the tertiary syntactors. These are all wrapped up into one ontic identity. This is the metaformal system. So this is the intrinsic. This is backwards. The intrinsic language of reality is the metaformal system, which is equivalent, or the metaformal system is equivalent to the intrinsic language of reality, which is expressing itself through this grammar of tellers and syntactors, which it has this alphabet, these fundamental building blocks from which it can express and communicate meaning. So you can think of these as the letters, which are, actualizing this. So its alphabet is these tellers and syntactors in the non-terminal and terminal domain, where the non-terminal domain is the potentialization of reality. The terminal domain is the actual representation and actualization of that intrinsic utility, and so this has to have actually one more level of syntax in order to actually instantiate that using these syntactic operators. And you can think about, in reality, where there is this intrinsic end and purpose, people will be like, well, why does biological life develop when there could have been so many different potential universes where life didn't develop? And actually, life and consciousness is actually a necessary outcome of biological evolution, because it's embedded into the structure of the universe itself. It has to have these intrinsic ends and purposes, and it has to be able to recognize itself, and that requires life and consciousness respectively. So if you take enough syntactic operators over a long enough period of time, and you take these as a function of the teleology, eventually it's basically a necessity that this will generate tellers, that this will instantiate the secondary level of utility from this generic syntax. And so this is why Chris Langan describes the CTMU as a meta-Darwinian theory, because Darwinism says there's natural selection and there are these various utility functions being played off against each other in reality, which then, by random mutation, eventually a few win out, which are the most advantageous to biological creatures over time. So what the CTMU meta-Darwinism would say is that this is what, barring any problems with Darwinism, this is what reality itself is doing. It's hologically self-replicating in order to test these utility functions against one another for the expression and communication of meaning using this intrinsic language, which is how reality relates to itself. And so meaning, which is the fundamental imperative of reality, actually has to be linguistic. When we say blank means blank, we're discussing the linguistic relationship between the two as a function of their teleology, as a function of what they're actually an expression of, which is how we can relate two things to one another. And when we say something is meaningful, that means that it actually is not superficial. It's not just touching on the surface structure, but is actually configured based on and responds well to our intrinsic structure, our human cognitive perceptual syntax, which is how we can, and our emotelic syntax. So these are our emotions, our logical syntax. So it's something which makes sense to us, which triggers certain emotions, which this qualio-perceptual syntax, which has all the right excitations in our mind to keep us active and engaged. So meaning is a function of all these different syntaxes, and syntax is one half of language, and then the meaning is the terminal instantiation of that. So this is why Chris Langan says cognition and perception themselves are languages. So the telos of the universe and the telos of ourselves is self-identification. And identity as well is a linguistic phenomenon. So God is looking into this true and good order created by these meta-linguistic relationships, and he's saying, I am like that. So you can think of the universe and the expression and communication of meaning as the individuation process of God. This is Jung talks about, there's these aspects of psychological maturity, and you have all these symbolic patterns, the same thing, which then describe the evolution and maturation process. And this is the same thing which is happening from the early stages of the universe, which is very chaotic and unorganized, and then as you abstract out, this can be both logically and temporally, because logic and time are to some extent similar, where both are a function of cognition and telic recursion. So logically or temporally, you can abstract out, and then as you get to the later stages of the universe and trickling into the future, you have this very ordered, even though people will say entropy, when you actually look at how the universe has evolved over time, this actually somewhat contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, because actually order has emerged, and the only reason it can do this is because of these telons, is because of these linguistic relationships in reality, which are calling forth particular states. And so you can think of this as reality maturing. So dualistic language theory, as the kind of language which doesn't include its universe as part of its structure, which holds language and universe to be absolutely separate from one another. This dualistic language theory. So either you're saying the universe doesn't contain language, or language doesn't contain the universe. This excludes everything that makes the universe or language telic and dynamic. So the only reason the universe is, and telic means purposeful, and dynamic means this power, but basically everything that makes the universe interesting is a function of language, and everything that makes language interesting is a function of its referring to the universe. So these two things can't be separated from one another. And if you do try to separate them from one another, even though it is logically inconsistent, you can formulate certain relationships within reality, even though you're doing this linguistically, which contradicts your initial premise. But you end up with a very unexciting universe. So this is why you see materialism and mechanistic materialism and metaphysical naturalism, which is actually a contradiction in terms, is the prevailing attitude among academic scientists is that language and universe have nothing to do with one another. The universe is basically just random particles crashing into one another, and eventually there's certain things which you can't really explain, which is it gives rise to certain things. But this is all really an accident of random mutation, whereas actually this is very purposeful on the part of reality according to the CTMU. And language, the academic science says, is just kind of our way of understanding reality, which is fundamentally separated from the universe itself. So ultimately we have epistemological limitations. We can't actually say what reality is fundamentally. And so this precludes any metaphysical understanding. And this is why this is so dangerous. So so the CTMU says objects and relations thereof are excitations or transformations on the underlying syntax according to these 5 utility functions that we discussed: the primary teller, the secondary teller, the primary syntactor, the secondary syntactors, and tertiary syntactors, and these various levels of syntax and telons relate clusters of symbolic meaning into a conception and simulation of deep reality, which is God's extended self. Again, this is the classical conception of God overflowing into creation and then extracting meaning from that. Everything exists for this. John Calvin's idea is that everything exists for the greater glory of God, and because God's self-exaltation is less than, let's say, what he deserves intrinsically, so there's this overflowing, this almost turning away, this world soul authoring intelligible reality, who's then telos, this is John Scotus's idea, the Irish Neoplatonist philosopher, that the telos of creation is that by the logos, by this metalinguistic identity of reality, can then turn back to its creator, and then all this interesting meaning can be extracted from that. And so it will probably help you if you actually think about it. It's not that far off to say reality is speaking English to itself, because English is a reland of this meta language. Obviously it's not speaking or writing, but based on your conception, this is even though a lot of people deride this and say this is too simplistic a way, you're dumbing it down. This is actually not true, because the reality speaking English to itself is the best way you can, if your first language is English, this is the best way you can conceive of the intrinsic meta language of reality and how reality relates to itself, because it's not that far off from what's actually happening. Obviously this meta language has deeper structure than any human reland. But that reminds me, there's this joke from Al Murray, a British comedian. He's talking about why England is the greatest country in the world, and he says the brain thinks naturally in English, and obviously that's not technically true, but there's something to that. So, but as they say in English, let the light shine forth in the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.